On a quiet October night in Phoenix, the kind of night where desert winds whisper through citrus trees, a family of four drifted to sleep, utterly unaware that someone they trusted more than almost anyone was already walking toward their front door. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a thief. He was their priest. Imagine that for a moment. A spiritual guide. A man who baptized their children. A man who stood in their living room, blessed their meals, and told them he would always protect them. But on this night, he arrived carrying latex gloves, zip ties, and a knife. What could possibly push a priest, someone meant to protect the vulnerable, to become the architect of a family's final moments? What kind of double life was he living? And how many people would only realize his mask had slipped after it was far too late? This is the story of trust weaponized, of a community betrayed, and of a family's final stand against a man no one ever suspected. Before we dive deeper, if you appreciate long-form documentaries that uncover hidden truths and real crime stories, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep producing in-depth work like this. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Arcadia wasn't the kind of place people associated with danger. Nestled in the heart of Phoenix, it was a neighborhood built on the quiet illusion that bad things happened elsewhere. Here, sunlight filtered gently through citrus trees. Streets curved lazily past well-kept lawns, and families waved at each other from driveways without ever feeling the need to glance over their shoulders. It was a community stitched together by routine morning jogs, weekend markets, school pickups, and the soft glow of porch lights that stayed on long after the desert sun dipped beneath the horizon. On the night of October 14th, the neighborhood lay under a calm so complete it felt almost delicate. The late evening warmth pleasant, thin, almost sleepy, wrapped around homes like a protective blanket. Even the wind seemed gentle, carrying with it the faint scent of orange blossoms that always lingered after sundown. Inside the Isaacs' home, the evening unfolded like countless others. There was no sign that this night would be any different, let alone catastrophic. The house reflected the steady heartbeat of a family rooted in routine. Textbooks stacked on the dining table, a half-finished jigsaw puzzle on the coffee table, baseball cleats drying near the back door, and Brandy's soft humming drifting from the laundry room. It was the kind of home you could walk into and feel instantly at ease, not because of anything spectacular, but because everything felt lived in, warm, and intentionally cared for. Robert sat at the kitchen island, his laptop open, glasses perched on the end of his nose as he scanned yet another spreadsheet. Numbers were usually his sanctuary, clean, logical, predictable. But tonight he kept rubbing his thumb against the edge of the keyboard, a quiet, unconscious gesture he made only when something troubled him. He paused every few minutes to stare at the documents he'd printed earlier, pages filled with highlighted transaction trails and notes scribbled in the margins. Anyone else might have seen them as harmless financial logs, but Robert knew better. He had been seeing the same disturbing pattern repeated for weeks, and the deeper he went, the harder it became to deny what he was uncovering. Across the room, Brandy folded a stack of fresh laundry with her usual precision. Each shirt placed gently, each towel aligned just right. She wasn't a woman who sought order for its own sake. She just understood how small rituals helped life feel grounded. But tonight, her movements were a touch slower, as though she was listening for something unsaid. She glanced at her husband from time to time, noticing the furrow in his brow, the quiet heaviness in his breathing. She didn't ask what was wrong, not because she didn't want to know, but because she already had a feeling. Robert had told her enough for her to sense the weight he carried. Maybe he was waiting for the right moment to share the rest. Upstairs, Sophia sat cross-legged on her bed, her notebook open, earbuds in, half listening to a playlist she always put on when she needed to think. She stared at the same paragraph in her journal without writing a single word. For weeks, She'd sensed that something was off, small whispers of tension between her parents, hushed conversations that paused when she walked into the room, the tiny flicker of concern in her dad's eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She didn't know the full story, but she knew it was serious. Serious enough that her father had stopped volunteering extra hours at the church. Serious enough that her mother had stopped inviting the priest to family dinners. And her little brother Thomas, barely 13, all elbows and enthusiasm, lay sprawled across his bed, game controller still in hand, the faint glow of the TV shining on his face. He had fallen asleep mid-game, still wearing the jersey he planned to use for baseball practice the next morning. He didn't sense the shift in his home, didn't recognize the quiet undercurrent running through the walls. For him, life remained simple, predictable, filled with sports, school, and the occasional grounding for forgetting to take out the trash. By 10 o'clock, the house began to settle into its familiar nighttime rhythm. The dishwasher hummed softly. A hallway light flickered to its timer. The last load of laundry was folded and stacked neatly. One by one, bedroom doors closed, and the home slowly drifted towards silence. If anyone had stood outside on the sidewalk and looked toward the Isaacs' warmly lit windows, they would have seen only a portrait of domestic peace, a family winding down, preparing for another ordinary day. But peace, as life often proves, can be heartbreakingly fragile. Beyond the glow of street lamps, beyond the desert breeze rustling the leaves, someone else was moving through the city. Someone who knew precisely where he was going, what he intended to do, and why this night of all nights could not be postponed. His car slipped through quiet streets without drawing attention. Headlights dimmed, license plates smeared intentionally with mud. He didn't play the radio, didn't check his phone. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles pale against the steering wheel. This wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a drifter or a burglar or someone passing through town. He was a man known to hundreds, someone people trusted, admired, confided in. Someone whose voice carried authority in whispered prayers and Sunday sermons. The Isaacs family, especially, had welcomed him into home and heart. They had shared meals with him, laughed with him, sought his guidance during difficult times. They had never once questioned his intentions. As he parked 3 blocks away, stepping out into the crisp October air, there was no hesitation in his movements, no tremor of doubt. Everything he had planned was already in motion, rehearsed in his mind over and over again. The gloves in his pocket, the knife in his bag, the zip ties he never imagined he would purchase but had done so anyway, telling himself the justification over and over. It has to be done. He walked with measured steps, blending into the darkness, avoiding the glow of porch lights. His silhouette passed quietly through the shadows of Arcadia's tiny streets, slipping toward a house where every member of the family trusted him so deeply that even if they saw his face at the door, they would never think to be afraid. Inside the Isaacs' home, sleep had already claimed the household. Sophia's lamp flickered off. Thomas snored softly through an open doorway. Robert left his laptop on the counter, promising himself he'd look at the files one last time in the morning. Brandy turned off the hallway light and whispered a small prayer, a habit she'd kept since childhood. It's almost cruel how ordinary their final moments were. If there were signs, a sudden noise, a strained flicker of intuition, they were too subtle to pull anyone from sleep. The house remained still, unaware of the figure approaching its door. A figure cloaked not in anonymity, but in the dangerous power of familiarity. That's the thing about betrayal. It rarely comes from the person you fear. More often, it comes from the person you'd never think to question. The one who knows exactly how to cross the threshold of your life without setting off alarm bells. And on this quiet October night, that person was already standing at the Isaacs' doorstep. Their tragedy did not begin with a scream. It began with trust. A trust they had spent years building. A trust they believed was sacred. A trust that was about to be shattered in the most irreversible way imaginable. Arcadia slept soundly. The stars shimmered with indifferent brilliance. And inside a modest two-story home filled with love, routine, and unspoken worries, 4 innocent people breathed their final peaceful breaths, moments before a man they would have died to protect became the reason they never woke again. Before tragedy turns ordinary people into headlines, they live lives that are beautifully, painfully human. The Isaacs were no different. They were not extraordinary in the way movies portray perfect families, but in the real, grounded way that makes a home feel alive through small rituals, inside jokes, and the invisible threads of love that stretch across every room. If you spent even 5 minutes in their house, you'd feel it. The warmth, the sense of belonging, the quiet harmony that families build not from perfection, but from trying every single day to take care of one another. Robert Isaac was the backbone of that home. Not in an overbearing patriarchal sense, but in the way steady, dependable men often are. He was the type who fixed leaky faucets on weekends, who stayed late at school board meetings because someone had to make sure the kids got what they needed, and who worked quietly behind the scenes without expecting credit. He didn't raise his voice often. He didn't need to. His calmness held weight. His presence alone told you things would be okay. What people admired most about him, though, wasn't his intelligence. It was his integrity. He believed rules mattered. He believed honesty mattered. He believed people in positions of authority should uphold higher standards, not hide behind them. Ironically, it was this exact sense of principle that would make him a target. Brandy, his wife, was a teacher one of the kind students remembered years after graduating. She had a warm smile that softened even the most anxious students' nerves, and a way of explaining tough concepts that made kids feel like they'd learned something by magic. At home, she balanced mothering with compassion and a quiet strength. She noticed things others didn't. The way Robert's shoulders tensed when he was worried, the slight waver in Sophia's tone when she was upset, the restless energy in Thomas when he needed reassurance. People described her as the heart of the family. She never saw herself that way, but sometimes others can see what we don't. Their daughter, Sophia, was the thinker, sharp, articulate, always scribbling ideas in journals or debating friends on topics most teens didn't care about. She was the sort of kid who challenged teachers respectfully, researched things on her own, and questioned the world because she believed she could change it. Her dream was journalism. Not the glamorous TV anchor kind, but the investigative kind, the kind that digs for truth. It's chilling to think about now, how much she believed in exposing dishonesty, how she admired people who stood up against corruption, how proud she was of her father for doing the same, without knowing the danger he was walking into. And then there was Thomas, the life of the household, always moving, always talking, always discovering something new at full speed. He was the kind of kid who made the neighbors laugh as he raced down the sidewalk on a scooter that was probably going too fast. He adored his big sister, though he'd never admit it out loud. And he worshipped his father. In his eyes, Robert was a superhero disguised as an accountant. Together, they formed the kind of family that didn't just function, they thrived. They volunteered together on weekends. They hosted barbecues for neighbors. They welcomed church members into their home like extended relatives. They celebrated every small win, good grades, a new job opportunity, a baseball tournament in a way that made every achievement feel monumental. They weren't wealthy, but they were rich in the ways that matter most: connection, trust, laughter, stability. The Isaacs weren't perfect, of course. They bickered, got stressed, disagreed about chores, misread each other's moods, just like every family does. But even their flaws made them more endearing. It was this authenticity, this unguarded openness, that made what happened to them feel like a violation of something sacred. Where some people live behind emotional walls, the Isaacs lived with the door open literally and figuratively. That openness, unfortunately, made it easier for danger to enter unnoticed. Their lives intertwined deeply with their church community, a place where they found meaning, friendships, and a strong sense of purpose. They weren't devout to the point of blind devotion, but they were committed, present, involved. They volunteered. They donated. They attended services consistently. And at the center of much of that involvement was one man, Father Michael Donovan, a priest whose voice filled the church with comforting certainty, a man who charmed crowds with warmth and gentle humor, someone who carried an aura of stability, someone people naturally gravitated toward. He led charity drives, counseled troubled teens, and visited families during hardship. To many, he was a pillar. To some, even a surrogate father. And to the Isaacs, he was someone they trusted implicitly. He visited their home often. He shared meals with them. He prayed over their worries. He gave Thomas spiritual advice. He encouraged Sophia's journalistic dreams. He confided in Robert about church matters. The Isaacs never questioned his presence because nothing about him seemed out of place. Not at first, but this is how manipulation works. It's never loud, never abrupt. It begins with trust, with closeness, with familiarity. In the Isaacs case, it began years earlier, long before the night everything came undone. Robert, being who he was, a man of numbers, logic, and quiet responsibility, had volunteered to help the church audit its financial records. It was meant to be routine, simple, a way for him to contribute his expertise. He didn't expect to find discrepancies. He didn't expect to uncover irregularities. He didn't expect to stumble upon patterns that suggested more than mere oversight. He certainly didn't expect the irregularities to lead back to a man the community adored. But Robert didn't jump to conclusions. That wasn't his nature. He checked the numbers again, then again. He cross-referenced documents. He asked for additional statements. The more he dug, the more the truth sank in. And at some point, inevitably, the truth stopped being blurry. He realized someone had been siphoning money, quietly, over time, with precision. And the person responsible wasn't some nameless employee or outside scammer. It was Father Donovan. This discovery placed Robert in a position he never wanted to be in. It was the kind of truth that doesn't just weigh on the mind. It anchors itself into every inch of your conscience. He discussed it quietly with Brandy, who urged him to follow the right path, even if it was uncomfortable. That's who they were. People who believed doing what was right mattered more than doing what was easy. But doing what was right often comes with a cost. Brandy didn't know how deep the danger ran. Robert didn't know how much Donovan suspected. Sophia sensed something but didn't understand the gravity. And Thomas, young, innocent, hopeful Thomas, had no idea that the man who sometimes high-fived him after Sunday services had been watching his family a little too closely, a little too intently. What makes the Isaacs story so painful isn't just the loss, but the betrayal wrapped around it. They opened their home and hearts to a man they believed represented moral guidance. They offered him unwavering trust. They welcomed him into their most private spaces. They didn't realize they were letting a predator study them. A perfect family is not one without flaws. A perfect family is one whose members genuinely love, support, and believe in each other. The Isaacs were that kind of family. Their kindness wasn't strategic. Their trust wasn't conditional. Their openness wasn't naive. It was simply who they were. And tragically, these very qualities made them vulnerable to someone who saw trust not as something sacred, but as something exploitable. For Donovan, they weren't just parishioners. They were a threat. A warm, tightly connected, principled unit capable of unraveling his carefully hidden secret. And in his twisted mind, the closeness that made them admirable also made them dangerous. Because close families share. Close families talk. Close families piece together truth faster than isolated individuals ever could. And so, in the most horrifying and unimaginable way, their goodness, Everything that made the Isaacs beloved by their community also painted a target on their backs. They didn't know it. They couldn't know it. But while they were busy living their lives with genuine love and honesty, someone else was busy calculating how to erase them forever. Long before Father Michael Donovan became the man whose name would echo through courtrooms and true crime documentaries, he was something entirely different in the eyes of the community. A symbol of safety. A figure people leaned on when life pushed them to their knees. A man who carried himself with such quiet conviction that even skeptics found themselves trusting him without hesitation. His fall from grace does not begin the night he murdered a family. It begins decades earlier, in the subtle cracks of a life carefully crafted to deceive everyone around him. To understand how Donovan became capable of such calculated violence, you have to understand the person he was before the mask slipped. He didn't grow up with the intense religiosity people might assume. His childhood wasn't filled with choir robes and Sunday sermons. It was filled with instability. His father drifted in and out of jobs, and his mother carried a constant tension in her face, a woman stretched thin by survival. Donovan learned early that appearances mattered. In his home, peace came only when things looked peaceful. Order wasn't truth. It was protection. He wasn't the quiet kid in school. If anything, he was charismatic, quick-witted, strangely adaptive. Teachers adored him because he participated. Students admired him because he always seemed to know how to impress adults without appearing like a teacher's pet. He had an uncanny talent. He could read people. Read their weaknesses, their desires, their vulnerabilities. A skill like that is harmless in the hands of a good person. But in the hands of someone who craves approval above authenticity, it becomes a weapon. Religion entered Donovan's life not as a calling, but as a shelter. When he was 17, his mother died suddenly, and the church community near his home offered him stability meals, emotional support, a purpose. He liked how the congregation looked up to him when he spoke during youth sessions. He liked the sense of authority he felt when people sought comfort from him. In the church, Donovan found something he'd never had. A place where admiration was given freely, and questioning him felt socially unacceptable. By the time he entered seminary school, he had perfected the art of blending humility with calculated charm. Professors described him as bright, thoughtful, and compassionate. He learned how to speak with a tone that evoked trust, how to hold silence until people felt compelled to confide in him, how to keep eye contact long enough to feel sincere, but not enough to feel confrontational. He studied psychology on his own time, not formally, but obsessively. He consumed books about persuasion, human behavior, and leadership. Not for personal growth, but for advantage. People mistook his ambition for passion. They mistook his confidence for faith. They mistook his manipulative talent for emotional intelligence. When Donovan was ordained, he stepped into his new role not as a servant of God, but as a man who understood he had just gained the perfect stage. A collar is a powerful thing. It disarms suspicion. It grants authority without the need to earn it. It places you in the center of people's most intimate confessions, fears, and vulnerabilities. Donovan loved that access. Loved how people looked at him with expectation and belief. Loved how much information he was given without needing to ask. He cultivated trust like other people cultivate gardens, meticulously, strategically, patiently. By the time he arrived at St. Matthew's Church in Phoenix, he had already mastered the persona he wanted the world to see. He was the approachable priest, the one who joked lightly during sermons to keep people engaged, the one who attended every fundraiser, who remembered details about families, who checked in on sick parishioners. To outsiders, he was selfless. To insiders, he was indispensable. To himself, he was invincible. Over the years, he built a public identity so airtight that even people who disliked religion admired him. They described him as gentle, dedicated, kind. Some said he reminded them of an uncle. Others said he felt like a father figure. He took special interest in families who seemed tightly bonded families like the Isaacs because they represented stability he never had, yet craved desperately. Being close to them made him feel anchored, even as he drifted ethically, financially, morally. This is the part of Donovan's story that reveals the depth of his deception. He wasn't simply stealing money. He wasn't merely hiding a double life. He was constructing an identity that fed an internal hunger for control. At first, the financial discrepancies were small. A few $100s unaccounted for. A check rewritten with a vague explanation. Church records were not tightly monitored, and Donovan exploited that. When nothing happened, he grew bolder. He created fictional charity allocations. He shifted funds between accounts. He used church credit cards for personal expenses, disguising them under vague labels that no one questioned. Why would they? He was a priest. He was trustworthy by default. Over time, the money he siphoned supported a life no one suspected he lived. Beyond the parish, Donovan frequented upscale restaurants, maintained an expensive apartment under a secondary identity, and indulged in luxuries that sharply contrasted the image of humble service he portrayed to the public. He convinced himself that these indulgences were harmless compensation for the emotional labor he provided the community. In his mind, he wasn't stealing. He was taking what he felt he deserved. But this self-justification spiraled. The deeper he waded into deception, the more paranoid he became about discovery. He grew possessive of financial documents, dismissive of oversight suggestions, defensive when asked routine questions. His once charming demeanor developed hairline fractures. He smiled through gritted teeth. He tightened control over church operations. He manipulated staff into trusting him blindly, offering sympathy to some and intimidation to others. And then came the Isaacs. To Donovan, they were the ideal parishioners, kind, thoughtful, genuine, unwavering in their faith. He saw them as emotionally accessible, yet principled. Their home became a familiar refuge, a place where he felt welcomed without question. But as their bond strengthened, so did his desire to maintain their trust. Their admiration fed him. Their approval soothed him. Their warm family dynamic gave him a sense of belonging he never had in his own childhood home. But admiration is dangerous when the person receiving it cannot tolerate loss. When Robert volunteered to audit the church's financial records, Donovan didn't panic immediately. He believed he could manipulate the outcome. He believed he could charm his way through it the way he always had. But Robert's sharp mind and unwavering integrity were different from anything Donovan had dealt with. Robert didn't gloss over inconsistencies. He didn't assume innocence. He didn't treat Donovan's position as a shield. For the first time in years, Donovan felt exposed. He tried subtle intimidation. A few strategic, guilt-driven conversations. A gentle suggestion that Robert focus on other responsibilities. When that failed, he tried to sabotage the audit by restricting access to certain documents. But Robert persisted, and Donovan saw a threat he couldn't contain through manipulation alone. This is where his transformation solidified. A man who builds his entire life on deception becomes catastrophically dangerous when cornered. Donovan's fear mutated into resentment. Resentment hardened into entitlement. Entitlement fueled a murderous logic. If someone threatens your world, you remove the threat. By the time he realized Robert had uncovered enough evidence to implicate him, Donovan had already lost the ability to stop himself. He convinced himself that Robert wasn't simply exposing him. He was destroying the church, hurting the community, misinterpreting the truth. In Donovan's warped reasoning, the Isaacs had become villains in a narrative he believed he controlled. The moment he embraced that delusion, the fate of an innocent family was sealed. People often ask, how could a priest commit such a crime? How could someone capable of offering comfort also be capable of unspeakable violence? But predators rarely look like monsters. They look like mentors, leaders, friends, spiritual guides. Donovan's greatest deception was not the money he stole, it was the persona he constructed. A persona so convincing that even the most intuitive people never saw the darkness beneath it. In truth, Donovan was not two different men. He was one man who had learned to wear two faces, one for the world, and one for himself, behind the collar, behind the charm, behind the practiced empathy. There was a man who believed authenticity was optional, morality was flexible, and trust was a tool he could fashion into anything he wanted, even murder. Every tragedy has a moment, an invisible turning point, when the future shifts quietly, long before anyone realizes it. In the story of the Isaacs, that moment wasn't a scream in the night or a confrontation gone wrong. It wasn't dramatic or violent or even emotional. Instead, it happened in broad daylight, in a quiet church office filled with dusty binders and the faint smell of old carpet. A simple discovery. A line of numbers that didn't add up, a pattern that shouldn't have existed, and a man who refused to walk past the truth, even when it led straight into danger. For Robert Isaac, the secret began with something small, something he almost ignored. He had been reviewing the church's quarterly budget, noting the usual fluctuations, youth programs, maintenance fees, community outreach costs, when a subtle detail caught his eye. A recurring payment listed under Community Development Assistance. The number wasn't large enough to raise alarm, but something about its timing seemed off. It appeared twice in 1 month, then disappeared for 2, then reappeared again under a slightly altered label. It was the financial equivalent of a whisper easy to miss, easy to dismiss. But Robert wasn't the kind of man who dismissed whispers. He knew from experience that the smallest irregularities often revealed the biggest truths. At first, he assumed it was a clerical mistake. Churches weren't corporate offices. They didn't always follow rigid accounting standards. But when he flipped through previous statements, he noticed the payment trail stretched back further than he expected. Months, then years. Consistent, but inconsistent. Familiar, but wrong. So he dug deeper. He requested access to earlier financial records, the ones most people never bothered to look at. He asked the church treasurer to send him scanned copies of older invoices. He quietly pulled bank reports from years when oversight had been more relaxed. And with each document he examined, the pattern grew sharper, clearer, more undeniable. Money wasn't just disappearing. It was being siphoned with precision. Small amounts at first, just enough to seem like routine administrative expenses. But over time, the increments increased. A few hundred here, a few thousand there, always disguised behind vague descriptions. Always slipping through without scrutiny. And always, without fail, authorized by one person, Father Michael Donovan. When Robert realized this, something cold settled into his chest. Not shock, exactly, but disappointment. Deep, painful disappointment. This wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. This was a betrayal of a community, of trust, of faith. Still, he didn't jump to judgment. Robert believed in fairness, in the importance of context. Maybe there were legitimate reasons for these transfers. Maybe the financial system was outdated. Maybe someone else had signed off in Donovan's name. He needed clarity, not suspicion. So he approached Donovan not confrontationally, but cautiously. He asked for clarification on the expenditures. He brought copies of the questionable reports. He framed his concerns gently, as if he wanted reassurance, not answers. And that's when everything shifted. Donovan didn't respond like an innocent man. He didn't show confusion. He didn't ask to review the documents or offer to help. Instead, he tensed subtly but unmistakably. His smile tightened. His posture stiffened. His replies grew rehearsed, evasive. He insisted the expenditures were for sensitive community needs. He claimed privacy concerns. He changed the subject twice. He reminded Robert how deeply stressful church administration could be, and hinted that perhaps he was reading too much into things. But Robert saw the flicker of anxiety in Donovan's eyes. The mask had slipped for a moment, and that was enough. From that point on, Donovan watched Robert differently. He became overly friendly, too friendly. He began checking in on the family unexpectedly, offering support, inviting Robert to talk things through, calling to ask whether he needed help with anything. It was a tactic, a lure, a way to keep Robert close enough to monitor. But Robert didn't back off. If anything, he dug deeper. He spent evenings researching financial laws related to nonprofit organizations. He reached out quietly to a former colleague for advice. He compared bank statements line by line. He traced cash withdrawals. He mapped the frequency of suspicious transfers. And slowly, a horrifying picture took shape. Donovan hadn't just mismanaged funds. He had been embezzling money for at least 5 years. Tens of thousands of dollars, possibly more. Money meant for food drives, youth programs, charity relief, family support services. Money the community had given in good faith. Robert didn't know the full extent, but he knew enough to understand the crime was serious criminally and morally. And Donovan? He sensed the walls closing in. Those who manipulate for a living recognize the moment someone stops being pliable, the moment someone stops accepting the script. And to Donovan, Robert had become a threat, a quiet, intelligent man who saw too much and spoke too little. As the weeks passed, Donovan grew restless. His sermons lost their warmth. His visits to the Isaac home became more forced. He started probing the family with strange questions. How often they talked about church matters, whether Robert discussed accounting details with Brandy, whether Sophia was the type to be curious about adult issues. They didn't notice the subtle danger in his words. Not yet, but Donovan noticed something in Robert, a resolve. And resolve, to a man built on lies, is terrifying. Meanwhile, Brandy began to sense a shift as well. She noticed how exhausted her husband looked, how he lingered over documents long after dinner, how his mind drifted during conversations. She would ask if everything was okay, and Robert, protective to his core, always reassured her. But Brandy could read him better than anyone, and she knew. He was carrying something heavy. Sophia sensed it too. She caught glimpses of whispered conversations between her parents, saw tension in her father's eyes, felt the unspoken weight in the air. It made her curious, uneasy, and quietly anxious. But she didn't pry, not yet. And Donovan? His unease evolved into paranoia. He started imagining consequences, losing his position, losing his status, losing the life he had built behind closed doors, losing control. The financial crimes were bad enough, but exposure meant something worse: humiliation. Donovan feared humiliation more than anything. He couldn't tolerate the idea of people seeing him as a fraud. In his mind, Robert wasn't a man doing his duty. He was an enemy threatening to tear down everything Donovan had spent years constructing. The breaking point came when Robert requested access to the church's restricted account logs, files Donovan never intended anyone to see. Files that contained exact details of his transfers, his fake charity entries, and the ghost organizations he had created to funnel money through. That's when Donovan understood something clearly. Robert had enough information to destroy him, and he wouldn't stop. The secret was no longer contained in spreadsheets. It wasn't a quiet worry. It was a living, breathing threat. A fuse already lit, and Donovan made a choice. The kind of choice only someone drowning in their own lies could make. A choice formed not from panic, but from entitlement. From the belief the consequences were for other people, not for him. He told himself he would not let Robert ruin his life. He told himself the Isaacs were misguided, misinterpreting the situation, overreacting. He told himself it was necessary. And in a chilling twist of self-deception, he convinced himself he was the true victim. When a manipulator loses control, they don't surrender. They escalate. And Donovan's escalation began quietly. A late-night drive past the Isaac home. A phone call he didn't intend to answer. A set of documents he destroyed. A lie he told during confession to test whether rumors were spreading. A second phone call this time to someone who could vouch for him. But most disturbing of all were his visits. He showed up unannounced at the Isaac home more frequently, each time watching, observing, evaluating. He'd sit in their living room, smiling politely, while his mind worked mechanically. Had Sophia overheard anything? Had Brandy seen the documents? Had Thomas asked questions? Could he manipulate Robert? Could he scare him? Could he stop him? He studied them like pieces of a puzzle he needed to dismantle. And the Isaacs, good, trusting, open-hearted people, never saw the predator standing in their living room. They saw a priest, a friend, a man who had blessed their home, a man whose heart they believed was rooted in faith. But the truth was far darker. Behind that collar stood a man who had already begun planning how to silence them. Because the secret Robert uncovered wasn't just dangerous, it was damning. And in Donovan's twisted world, anyone who threatened that secret had already signed their death warrant. There are nights that begin like any other and end up etched in history for all the wrong reasons. October 14th was one of those nights. It unfolded with the kind of ordinary calm that makes what came afterward feel even more unreal, as if the universe had paused to inhale before releasing a storm no one could have predicted. The Isaacs went to bed believing the world outside was exactly as it had always been, safe, familiar, quietly predictable. They didn't know that every breath they took that evening carried them closer to a moment already set in motion by someone they once trusted without reservation. Around 11:40 p.m., Father Michael Donovan parked 3 blocks away, just far enough that no passing neighbor would recognize his car. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, stretching like dark fingers toward the edges of the quiet suburban blocks. Donovan sat in the driver's seat longer than he needed to. He wasn't hesitating, not in a moral sense, at least. He was calculating, visualizing every step of what was about to unfold. He opened his glove compartment with controlled precision and removed the thin latex gloves he'd bought that morning, along with a roll of duct tape, zip ties, and a sharpened utility knife. He placed each item beside him like instruments laid out before a surgeon. Except nothing about his preparations held any compassion, any desire to heal. Everything he did tonight was aimed at elimination, removing a threat, erasing a problem, silencing the one man who could expose him. Outside, the desert air was cooler than usual, brushing gently across his face as he stepped out of the vehicle. He closed the door without a sound, practiced and deliberate. His shoes barely disturbed the gravel as he made his way down the sidewalk. Arcadia slept around him, unaware of the predator navigating its quiet streets. Porch lights glowed softly above welcome mats. Wind chimes rattled faintly in the breeze. A pair of sprinklers hummed from a nearby yard, casting a mist that caught the moonlight in a refracted shimmer. To anyone else, the neighborhood looked peaceful, idyllic, even. But for Donovan, it was a stage one he believed he controlled entirely. When he reached the Isaac Street, he slowed his pace. The house was dark, except for a dim hallway light visible through a second-floor window. He had been inside this home countless times. He knew the layout. He knew the squeaky stand near the landing, the deadbolt that sometimes caught if it wasn't turned just right, the window in the living room that never fully latched unless pressed firmly. All this familiarity didn't comfort him, it emboldened him. He had studied the Isaacs without realizing he was preparing for this night. Each visit, each shared meal, each conversation had given him information he could now use against them. He approached the side path leading to the backyard, staying close to the fence line to avoid motion sensors he knew only activated with movement near the center. He wore dark clothing, the kind that blended into night without effort. When he reached the back of the house, he exhaled slowly and put on his gloves. His hands didn't tremble. His heartbeat remained steady. He wasn't improvising. He was executing a decision he had convinced himself was necessary. The back door of the Isaacs' home wasn't flimsy, but Donovan knew its weakness. It had been sticking recently, a detail Robert had mentioned casually weeks before, never imagining the information would be used against him. Donovan pressed the latch firmly, then inserted a thin metal tool between the frame and lock. It took him less than 30 seconds before he heard the soft click of the mechanism giving way. He slipped inside like a shadow. The house greeted him with stillness. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint aroma of cinnamon from a candle brandy had blown out earlier. A jacket hanging on the back of a dining chair. Everything looked untouched, innocent. Donovan stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. He listened, really listened, for any sign that someone might be awake. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. Only the gentle ticking of the wall clock near the kitchen. He moved through the living room with practiced stealth. The moonlight filtering through the curtains gave the room a pale silver glow, barely enough to see shapes and outlines. He made his way to the staircase, pausing at its base. He knew the first step creaked softly, so he stepped over it, landing on the second step without a sound. He ascended slowly, his breath controlled, his mind focused entirely on the task ahead. Upstairs, the hallway stretched toward 3 bedrooms. The first belonged to Thomas, the second to Sophia, the third to Robert and Brandy. Donovan stood at the top of the stairs for several seconds, listening. His ears tuned into the soft rhythmic patterns of sleeping bodies, the gentlest rise and fall of breaths. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't conflicted. In his mind, this was self-preservation, not cruelty, a necessary erasure of a threat. He approached the master bedroom first. The door was slightly ajar, not enough to reveal much, but just enough for him to slip inside. Robert lay closest to the door, his breathing steady, his posture relaxed in the unguarded way people sleep when they feel safe. Brandy lay beside him, curled slightly toward his direction, one hand resting near his shoulder. Donovan stepped closer. He removed a knife from his bag. The room felt impossibly still, as if time itself was holding its breath in anticipation. He leaned over Robert quietly, almost reverently, as if he were about to administer a blessing instead of an attack. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face. Not hesitation, not remorse, but an odd, chilling solemnity. A distorted sense of purpose. He tightened his grip on the knife. The first strike was swift, silent, delivered with someone else's certainty. Robert's eyes opened halfway through the motion, a reflex, a final attempt by the body to understand what was happening, but he never had the chance to scream. Donovan pressed his free hand over Robert's mouth to muffle any sound. Brandy woke to the movement, confusion clouding her expression. But before she could react, Donovan turned on her. It wasn't messy for him. It wasn't frenzied. It was controlled, methodical, the kind of violence that doesn't burst from rage, but drips from cold calculation. Afterward, he stood over their bodies for several seconds, breathing deeply but not heavily, the way someone might pause after completing a difficult but necessary task. In his mind, the biggest threat, the person who could expose him, was gone, but he wasn't finished. He couldn't leave witnesses. He moved toward the hallway with a strange composure. He stepped into Thomas's room next. The boy lay on his stomach, wrapped in a blanket, one arm dangling off the side of the bed. Donovan watched him for a moment, and there was something almost eerie in the way his expression didn't shift. There was no hesitation, no confusion, no sense of internal conflict. Children, to him, were simply smaller obstacles. The act was swift, merciless, final. Then he moved to Sophia's room. Her desk lamp was still on, illuminating her journal filled with handwritten notes, ideas, and paragraphs she intended to refine. The glow cast a soft light across her face as she slept. She looked peaceful, unaware of the cold presence standing just feet from her. Donovan hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of conscience, but calculation. She was older. She might fight back. She might scream louder, but the moment passed quickly. The violence was brief, efficient, eerily quiet. When it was done, the house returned to silence. A silence so heavy it felt as though the walls themselves absorbed the horror that had unfolded within them. Donovan made his way downstairs, cleaning what he could, wiping what he remembered touching, moving with the mechanical precision of someone who had rehearsed every step. He washed his hands. He checked his clothes for stains. He wiped the doorknobs. He scanned the room with a final meticulous glance. Then he left, not with panic, not with haste, but with a chilling calm, as if he had simply finished a difficult task and was ready to return to his life. Outside, the wind blew softly, carrying the faint desert chill through the streets of Arcadia. The stars shone the same as they always did. Sprinklers continued humming. A distant dog barked once, then settled again. Nothing in the neighborhood betrayed that a nightmare had unfolded behind the walls of a quiet family home. Donovan walked back to his car, removed his gloves, and placed them into a plastic bag. He started the engine, turned on the headlights, and drove away, disappearing into the sleeping grid of streets that trusted him blindly. Behind him, inside the Isaacs' home, lay the aftermath of a choice made by a man who believed his secrets were more important than 4 human lives. A man who convinced himself he had no other option. A man who believed he could outsmart consequences. A man who left a house full of silence where laughter once lived. And as the night slipped into dawn, the world remained unaware of what had happened. No alarms. No cries. No witnesses. Just an empty stillness lingering over the place where a family once dreamed of tomorrow. Morning sunlight in Arcadia usually slipped gently across rooftops, warming the edges of windows and creeping softly through curtains until families stirred awake to the promise of another quiet desert day. But on October 15th, the light felt different, sharper, colder, somehow out of place. It stretched across the Isaac home without knowing that no one inside was rising to meet it. No laughter slipped down the stairs. No footsteps echoed in the hallway. No voices drifted from the kitchen. The house that had always been a place of life and warmth now felt frozen in a silence so unnatural it seemed to echo against the walls. The first person to sense something was wrong wasn't a relative or neighbor. It was Brandy's coworker, a fellow teacher named Diane. She had expected Brandy early that morning for a planning meeting they'd scheduled days before. Brandy was punctual to a fault. She once arrived 20 minutes early to avoid inconveniencing a parent who needed to talk. So when the clock crossed 8:30 and still no sign of her, Diane felt a strange discomfort settle in her stomach. At first, she blamed traffic or an unexpected errand. But by the time the bell rang and children began filing into classrooms, her worry became sharper, more pointed. She sent a quick text, "Everything okay?" and waited for the familiar 3 dots to appear. They never did. Meanwhile, at Thomas's middle school across town, his homeroom teacher called roll and paused when she reached his name. Thomas Isaac was never absent. He was the kind of kid who bounced into class every morning, backpack barely zipped, energy practically vibrating off him. His absence didn't make sense. She called the office. The office called home. No answer. They left a voicemail, unaware the phone they were calling sat in a house holding nothing but silence. Sophia's absence raised alarms quickly, too. She had a meeting scheduled for an upcoming school broadcast project, a meeting she had been looking forward to, one she'd spoken about passionately the day before. A journalism teacher, Mrs. Navarro, assumed at first that something minor had come up at home. But when she heard Thomas was also absent, A chill worked its way up her spine. Something wasn't right. Around 10:45 a.m., the first official request for a wellness check was placed. A combination of school administrators, Brandy's colleagues, and a concerned neighbor named Carol, who noticed the Isaac mailbox still packed with yesterday's mail, nudged police toward the home. Welfare checks were common in a community this size. Usually benign, occasionally frustrating, almost always resolved with a sheepish, "Sorry, overslept," or "We were out late." But when the patrol car rolled onto the Isaac street, Officer Kent Parker felt an unease he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the quiet of the block. Maybe it was the mailbox. Maybe it was the instinct that officers develop after years of seeing what other people don't. He parked in front of the house, stepped out, and approached the front door. He knocked, called out, knocked again. Nothing. No footsteps. No muffled voices. No dogs barking inside. Just a heavy silence that didn't match a family of 4 on a weekday morning. He tried the doorbell. Still nothing. He walked the perimeter of the house. Curtains drawn. Lights off. No movement. It wasn't definitive, but it wasn't normal either. By the time he returned to the front, a second patrol car had arrived. Officers exchanged a few quiet words before deciding they needed to enter. They called dispatch for permission. Once cleared, they attempted to open the door. Locked. The back door became the next option. It showed signs of being tampered with, subtle, but clear to trained eyes. A mark near the latch. A slight misalignment in the frame. They exchanged glances that required no explanation. When the back door finally swung open, the officers stepped inside cautiously, hands near their holsters, senses tuned to the possibility of anything: an intruder, a medical emergency, a domestic issue. But nothing could have prepared them for the scene waiting in the silent rooms above. At first, it was just the smell. Not overwhelming, not yet, but unmistakably wrong. A thick, metallic heaviness that clung to the air. Then came the stillness, the kind that vibrates against your instincts, a primal recognition that something violent has occurred. Officer Parker called out one last time, his voice echoing up the staircase in a way that made both officers freeze. There is a type of silence only found in homes touched by tragedy. Deep, suspended, unnatural. They moved upstairs in slow, measured steps. The first door they opened was Thomas's room. The sight inside stole their breath before the horror fully registered. Thomas's small form lay motionless in a way no sleeping child ever would. His face turned slightly to the side, a dried streak across the pillow. Officer Parker whispered something under his breath, something like a prayer, something like denial, and stepped backward instinctively. Training kicked in, but emotion fought it viciously. They had walked into scenes before: car accidents, overdoses, domestic disputes. But this was something entirely different. This was intentional. This was brutal. This was the destruction of innocence. They radioed for backup immediately, but they still had to open the remaining doors. They knew, but they had to see. Sophia's room was next. The officers hesitated at the threshold, as if entering would make it real. Her lamp was still on, her journal still open, her body still. Her dreams, ambitions, and future all extinguished by a violence that no one in the neighborhood could have imagined. One officer stepped aside and pressed a trembling hand to his forehead. He would later say that moment stayed with him for years, a fragment of memory he could never shake. A bright young girl murdered in the place she should have felt safest. And then the master bedroom. The officers moved with more urgency, now not to save, but to confirm. The sight inside was devastating. Robert and Brandy lay together in a frozen tableau that spoke of suddenness and terror. There were signs of struggle, but brief overpowered quickly. Officer Parker felt the breath leave his lungs. In that moment, the Isaac family transformed from a collection of concerns on a welfare call into victims of a crime so violent, so cruel, that even seasoned officers felt its weight settle in their bones. The house felt colder now. Every hallway, every corner, every object touched by the lives of the Isaacs seemed suspended in time. Brandy's folded laundry on the couch downstairs, Robert's laptop still open, Sophia's pen beside her notebook, Thomas's game controller resting on the carpet where he had dropped it the night before. Everything held a piece of who they were, everything except the future they should have still had. Within minutes, the home filled with law enforcement, detectives, crime scene technicians, medical personnel, supervisors. They moved like a quiet storm across the property, marking, photographing, analyzing, documenting. Blue gloves snapped on. Evidence bags rustled. Cameras clicked. Radios buzzed with controlled tension. Detective Mara Ellison, one of the lead investigators for Phoenix PD, arrived shortly after. She was known for her sharp perception and calm under pressure, but even she paused longer than usual at the foot of the staircase. She had 2 children close to Thomas's age. For a moment, she closed her eyes, inhaled slowly, and let the weight settle. Then she climbed the stairs. Each room told a different chapter of the same nightmare. The master bedroom revealed the precision, the intent, the speed. This wasn't an emotional outburst or robbery gone wrong. It was clean, deliberate violence. Thomas's room revealed innocence, struck down without hesitation. Sophia's room revealed a young life extinguished mid-dream, her lamp casting the last warmth she would ever know. And the house as a whole revealed something else, something that chilled every experienced investigator who walked through. There was no forced entry at the front. No signs of a break-in, no ransacking, no missing valuables. The killer hadn't entered like a stranger. They had entered like someone who understood the layout, someone who moved with confidence, someone who knew where each family member slept, someone who had a reason, not random rage, but calculated objective. Detective Ellison felt a cold clarity settle inside her. This wasn't just murder. This was extermination. This was personal. This was a threat neutralized, not a robbery, not a passion crime. This was someone protecting themselves from exposure. It was also the kind of case that tears communities apart. By the afternoon, news spread across Arcadia in waves of disbelief. Parents clung to their children tighter. Teachers wept in hallways. Neighbors gathered in stunned clusters on sidewalks, whispering fragmented sentences. The Isaacs. All of them gone. People who had spoken to the family just the day before now struggled to reconcile the horrific reality with the warmth they remembered. Reporters arrived quickly. Yellow tape wrapped across the perimeter. Police cars lined the street. Cameras pointed toward a house where just hours earlier, 4 loved ones had slept peacefully. And as night approached again, candles began appearing on the sidewalk. 1, then 3, then clusters of them, flickering in the cooling desert air. Inside the crime scene, investigators pieced together the timeline. They examined footprints, fingerprints, blood spatter, entry points, exit points. They documented every detail with meticulous precision. They didn't know the killer yet, not officially, but they knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whoever did this had been trusted. Investigators also knew something that would soon unravel everything. Robert's laptop wasn't just open. It was open to financial documents. Documents with highlighted irregularities. Documents referencing church accounts. Documents linked to internal discrepancies he had been reviewing. Detective Ellison leaned closer. "Get me everything connected to these," she said quietly. Because in that moment, she sensed what Robert had sensed. She saw the path he had been walking, and she understood that whatever he had discovered may have been the very thing that cost all 4 of them their lives. In the days that followed the discovery of the Isaac family's murders, Arcadia transformed from a neighborhood built on trust into a community wrapped in fear so thick it felt like a fog settling over every home. Curtains stayed drawn. Doors that once remained unlocked now had deadbolts, chains, and alarms activated even during daylight. Parents walked children to school instead of letting them bike or wander the sidewalks alone. Teachers watched their classrooms with a new, heightened protectiveness. The usual hum of conversation at local cafes and grocery stores was replaced with hushed whispers, fragments of fear passed between neighbors trying to make sense of the unimaginable. And in the middle of this wreckage stood someone who, on the surface, seemed to grieve with everyone else. Someone who walked among them as if he too was a victim of this tragedy. Someone who shook hands, offered condolences, prayed over broken families, and spoke with a trembling voice about the fragility of life. Someone who, if you didn't know better, would appear genuinely devastated. Father Michael Donovan. In the days after the murders, Donovan did something disturbingly bold. He inserted himself into the grieving process. He became the face of sorrow, the embodiment of spiritual comfort. He stood at the front steps of the church, greeting parishioners with strained eyes and carefully timed sighs. He led a candlelight vigil for the Isaacs, speaking with a tone so measured, so expertly controlled, that no one would have guessed the truth hiding beneath it. People clung to his words, not knowing he was the one who created the tragedy they were gathering to mourn. Detective Mara Ellison watched him from the edge of the crowd during the vigil. She didn't know yet what role he played, if any, but something about him made her pause. Not suspicion, exactly. More like intuition. He was too composed, too comfortable speaking on behalf of the grieving, too polished in the way he handled questions. Trauma usually fractures people in unexpected ways. Trembling hands, incomplete sentences. But Donovan? He was steady, grounded, ready, as if he had rehearsed this role long before the vigil began. Still, intuition wasn't evidence, and Ellison needed evidence. Back at the station, the investigation moved with relentless momentum. Detectives sifted through documents, phone logs, financial statements, and interviews. Forensic reports trickled in each one, sharpening the edges of the truth. The Isaac home revealed no signs of forced entry except at the back door, and even that looked expert-controlled, deliberate, not the frantic work of a burglar. Whoever entered the house knew what they were doing. They also knew where to go. The killer had moved through the home with precision, striking each victim in a pattern that suggested familiarity with the layout. There were no rummaged drawers, no valuables taken, no signs of disorganized rage. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was intentional, targeted, purpose-driven, and the person behind it hadn't acted in panic. They had acted in confidence. The financial documents on Robert's laptop became the investigation's compass. Detectives realized quickly that the irregularities Robert had been studying were no coincidence. The pattern of fraudulent entries pointed to long-term embezzlement, carefully constructed, expertly disguised. The logs showed years of siphoned funds from church accounts, all linked to transfers authorized by one person. Detective Ellison circled the name quietly on her notepad, Father Michael Donovan. But a financial motive wasn't enough. Detectives needed to understand the connection, how much Robert had uncovered, whether he had confronted anyone, whether Donovan was aware of Robert's suspicions. So they traced Robert's phone calls, emails, and documents. They discovered he had indeed reached out to the church treasurer weeks prior and later attempted to access restricted records Donovan had tightly controlled. His notes showed analysis of transactions he likely intended to present formally. This created a clear trajectory. Robert was building a case, and Donovan was running out of time. The circle began to tighten. Detectives brought Donovan in for an initial interview, not an accusation, just a conversation. He arrived with a humble posture, hands clasped, eyes soft, carrying an air of righteous grief. He spoke gently about the Isaacs, his voice wavering on command. He referred to them as cherished souls, pillars of the community, dear friends. He answered questions with smooth precision, offering practiced lines about his last interactions with the family. He claimed he had no knowledge of any issues, no indication that Robert had concerns about church finances. He made sure to emphasize how heartbroken he was. But Detective Ellison watched carefully. He never asked how they died, never asked when they were killed, never asked whether police had any leads. Most people confronted with a massacre, especially of close acquaintances, seek clarity. They ask details. They panic. They want reassurance. Donovan, however, already knew the details he pretended not to know. When the financial irregularities were brought up, his demeanor shifted subtly, but enough for a trained investigator to notice. His shoulders tightened. His tone sharpened. He attempted to regain control of the conversation, explaining the discrepancies as clerical errors, outdated accounting systems, miscommunications. He blamed volunteers. He blamed software. He blamed the previous treasurer, but not himself. Never himself. He even attempted to turn the narrative suggesting that perhaps Robert had misinterpreted the documents or overanalyzed simple inconsistencies, a quiet attempt to discredit the dead. It wasn't aggressive, just skillfully dismissive, the kind of phrasing that sounds reasonable until you see the patterns beneath it. Detective Ellison didn't reveal everything she knew. She didn't press too hard. She let him speak, let him talk himself into corners, let him reveal the cracks in his composure. Because in interviews like these, silence is sometimes more revealing than confrontation. The moment Donovan left the station, Ellison requested surveillance. Because at this point, Donovan wasn't simply a person of interest. He was emerging as the investigation's gravitational center. Days passed and forensic reports added new layers of clarity. Tiny fibers found on the back door matched materials consistent with gloves. Shoe impressions near the window matched a tread pattern found on a pair of Donovan's shoes he claimed he hadn't worn in weeks. Trace particles found beneath Robert's fingernails suggested brief defensive contact with someone wearing synthetic fabric, consistent with Donovan's clerical shirts. These details weren't definitive alone, but together they formed a mosaic. Meanwhile, Donovan continued performing the role of a grieving priest with eerie precision. He prayed with families. He walked the aisles of the church with a look of heavy despair. He comforted children who cried for Thomas and Sophia. He spoke emotionally at gatherings, his eyes glossy with perfectly timed tears. People found solace in his presence, never suspecting the truth. Publicly, he was a pillar. Privately, he was unraveling. Detectives noticed changes in his behavior. He made late-night drives without explanation. He visited storage units, bank ATMs, and remote areas with no clear purpose. He made calls from payphones, something almost no one did anymore. He purchased cleaning supplies he didn't need. He altered his routine subtly, as if preparing for an escape or erasing remnants of one. Surveillance teams saw it all. They documented every movement, every irregularity, every sign that Donovan was cracking beneath the pressure of an investigation quietly closing around him. The tension reached its peak when forensic analysts uncovered a breakthrough, a partial fingerprint, not a full one, but distinct enough found on the underside of the back door's lock mechanism, a place where only the intruder would have touched. It matched Donovan. That was it, the missing piece. The final thread tying him directly to the crime scene. Detectives moved quickly now, assembling a warrant, preparing for arrest, coordinating teams. They wanted to approach carefully. Donovan wasn't just a suspect. He was a public figure. His downfall would ripple through the community. They had to be thorough, cautious, precise. But before they could act, Donovan made a mistake. One night, just after 2 a.m., he drove to the desert outskirts, carrying a duffel bag he tossed into a ravine. Surveillance officers retrieved it hours later. Inside, they found items he should never have possessed. latex gloves with traces of dried blood, a shirt with microscopic fibers matching the Isaac carpet, and a burned folder containing scraps of financial documents he'd attempted to destroy. It was over. The investigation had everything it needed. When police arrived at the parish rectory to arrest Donovan, he didn't run. He didn't protest. He didn't lash out. He simply looked at the officers as if he had been expecting them, as if the moment had always been inevitable. His calmness chilled every detective in the room. He spoke only once, with a voice devoid of remorse. "Do what you must." And as he was handcuffed, escorted past parishioners who watched in stunned disbelief, the truth finally settled over Arcadia like a wave of bitter air. The killer had been among them the entire time, walking freely, comforting the grieving, performing sermons with a cross around his neck and 4 lives on his conscience. A killer hidden behind a collar. A predator disguised as a shepherd. A murderer who believed he was untouchable. But the lies he built his life upon had finally collapsed. And now, the community he deceived would watch the truth rise from the ruins of trust he shattered. The arrest of Father Michael Donovan spread across Arcadia like a shockwave that left the community staggering in disbelief. People did not simply hear the news. They felt it deep in their chests, in the pit of their stomachs, in the fragile space where trust lives. It was the kind of revelation that didn't just rupture public opinion, but tore at the very fabric of identity for people who had once looked to him as a moral anchor. The idea that a priest, a man who had blessed children, prayed over funerals, counseled the broken, could be led away in handcuffs for the brutal murder of a family was unthinkable. Some refused to believe it. Others fell silent, too stunned to form words. Many clung to denial, wrapping it around themselves like a shield to avoid facing the truth that had destabilized everything they thought they knew. Yet, while the community grappled with disbelief, the investigators felt a different shift, a quiet, purposeful tightening of the case as every detail began sliding into place. The arrest was not an end, but a doorway into a deeper, darker understanding of Donovan's deception. Now that the walls were closing in, his life, his real life, not the polished image he had maintained for decades, began to unravel piece by piece. Inside the interrogation room, the air felt heavier than usual. Donovan sat at the metal table with an unsettling stillness, the same controlled posture he carried during sermons, but stripped now of robes and reverence. He wore simple clothing, yet managed to sit as though he still held authority over the room. His face remained composed, as if he believed he could still manipulate the outcome, talk his way out of responsibility, reshape the narrative with the right combination of calmness and calculated remorse. But Detective Mara Ellison watched him with the measured patience of someone who had seen countless versions of this performance. She knew the language of subtle deflection, the posture of practiced innocence, the tone of a man who believed the world owed him sympathy even as he denied his own cruelty. When she placed the first piece of evidence on the table, a photograph of the partial fingerprint found inside the broken lock, Donovan's expression changed only slightly. Barely perceptible, but unmistakable to Ellison's trained eye. His pupils tightened, his throat swallowed once. A shift in posture, so minor an untrained observer might have missed it, signaled the first crack in the carefully controlled mask he had spent years perfecting. "We found this on the back door," Ellison said calmly. "The only point of forced entry. You know that door, don't you? You've used it before during your visits." Donovan blinked once, slowly, as if rehearsing the most strategic response. "That house was like home to me," he said, his voice soft, weighted with superficial sorrow. "I visited often. I prayed with them. I comforted them. If my fingerprint is there, it's because I was a trusted friend." But Ellison wasn't swayed. She placed a second item on the table, the gloves recovered from the desert ravine. "Your DNA is on the inside," she said. "The Isaac's DNA is on the outside." Something in Donovan's eyes flickered, a brief, involuntary spark that betrayed his internal calculation. He was cornered, and he knew it. But he clung to the performance because it was the only tool he had left. "I don't know how that's possible," he murmured. "There must be some mistake. Someone must have planted." "Michael," Ellison cut in gently, "no one planted anything. You were seen disposing of these. We have it all on camera." For the first time, Donovan's composure faltered. Not completely. His pride didn't allow for full collapse, but a crack formed, widening just enough for Ellison to see the truth leaking through. Not remorse, not fear, but anger. Pure, cold, entitled anger that simmered beneath the surface, waiting to surge forward. Investigators continued building the case with methodical precision. Donovan's financial records, once a tangled web of forged entries and strategically mislabeled transactions, were now laid bare. Forensic accountants traced every dollar, every false charity designation, every suspicious transfer routed through the church's accounts. The deeper they dug, the more staggering Donovan's embezzlement became. He had drained tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands over several years, funneling it into personal expenses that violated not only moral codes, but legal ones. High-end dinners. A hidden apartment under a secondary identity. Luxury purchases. Private retreats. All funded by the trust of the very people he had spiritually guided. His secret life was not a single mistake. It was an entire architecture of deception. Neighbors who once greeted Donovan with warm smiles now avoided eye contact, shaken by the realization of how thoroughly he had fooled them. Parishioners cried openly, not only for the Isaacs, but for the collapse of a faith they had built around the man who betrayed them. Parents whispered anxiously about the time Donovan had counseled their children. Couples revisited memories of confessions they once believed were safe. People questioned everything, what they had shared, what he had heard, what he had manipulated. The church's leadership faced its own reckoning. Questions emerged about oversight, about blind trust, about the institutional shield that had allowed Donovan to go unchecked for so long. Some officials tried to distance themselves from him, claiming they had never seen warning signs. Others stepped forward to accept responsibility, acknowledging the failures that had allowed Donovan's second life to flourish undetected. But the most haunting revelations came from Donovan's digital footprint. His laptop, seized during the arrest, held a collection of messages, documents, and online activity that painted a chilling picture of escalating paranoia. He had monitored Robert's social media accounts. He had researched legal penalties for financial crimes. He had searched phrases like, "How long after death does DNA degrade?" and silent killing methods. He had bookmarked articles about criminal investigations, surveillance loopholes, and even true crime cases with disturbingly similar patterns. His internet search history wasn't just unsettling, it was incriminating. Detectives also uncovered deleted messages, some partially recoverable, that suggested Donovan had known with certainty that Robert's suspicions were real. He had attempted to manipulate him, sending messages disguised as concern. He had offered to meet with Robert privately to clarify misunderstandings, a meeting Robert had politely declined. There were also notes, handwritten scraps recovered in his storage unit that detailed the Isaac family's routines, when they left for work, when they returned home, which rooms they slept in, what time the lights usually turned off. Details so intimate, so deliberate, they revealed the horrifying truth. Donovan had planned the murders long before he acted. His calmness wasn't confidence, it was preparation. The community's denial began to crumble as the evidence grew overwhelming. Those who once defended Donovan's character now found themselves shaken, unmoored. They attended his hearings not to support him, but to confront the truth with their own eyes. The man they had held in spiritual esteem now sat behind a table in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists, staring forward with the hollow gaze of someone who had lost control of the narrative. It was during one of these hearings that the final crack in Donovan's facade appeared. As prosecutors read through the list of evidence, blood, fingerprints, financial documents, surveillance footage, Donovan's composure broke for the first time in a visible, undeniable way. His jaw tightened. His nostrils flared. His lips trembled not with sadness, but with fury. It was as if he could no longer hold the mask in place, as if the courtroom's fluorescent lights had melted away the last remnants of the persona he had spent his entire life sculpting. Detective Ellison watched him closely from the gallery. She recognized the look, the expression of a man who wasn't mourning his victims, but mourning his own downfall. His eyes didn't show grief. They showed resentment, anger at being caught, anger at losing power, anger at the one family who had dared to pull back the veil. Outside the courtroom, the community grappled with the truth that had emerged. Grief counselors were brought into schools. Churches held support circles instead of sermons. Neighbors checked on each other more frequently than ever before. The Isaacs' names appeared on posters, candlelit vigils, memorial walls, and handwritten letters left by people who felt the family deserved justice, remembrance, and dignity. And yet, through all of this, the most unsettling truth lingered. The monster had not looked like a monster. He had worn a collar. He had offered blessings. He had smiled with gentle eyes. And beneath that smile, he had carried darkness deep enough to swallow an entire family. The cracks in Donovan's collar were now fully exposed, no longer hairline fractures, but a complete shattering of the illusion he had built around himself. The man behind the mask was finally visible to everyone, and what they saw was not a shepherd, not a guide, not a man of God. What they saw was a predator who believed he was untouchable. Now, with the truth laid bare, only one question remained. What consequences awaited a man who had turned faith into a weapon and trust into a death sentence? That answer would come in the next chapter, inside a courtroom, under oath, where Donovan would face what he feared most, a truth he could no longer manipulate. The trial of Father Michael Donovan began on a cool spring morning, the kind where sunlight creeps over the courthouse steps with a quiet, deliberate steadiness, as if even the weather understood that something monumental was about to unfold inside those stone walls. By dawn, people had already begun to gather outside, reporters setting up tripods, camera operators adjusting angles, community members standing in tight clusters with folded arms and tense expressions. Some came seeking justice, some seeking closure, and many came simply because they needed to witness with their own eyes the legal confrontation between a fallen spiritual leader and the truth he had spent years hiding behind sermons and sanctimony. The line to enter the courtroom stretched past the metal detectors and spilled into the lobby, where hushed conversation swept through the crowd like a tide, fragments of disbelief, anger, confusion, and grief, mixing with the sterile echo of fluorescent lights humming overhead. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense enough to feel almost physical. Every seat was filled. Observers sat shoulder to shoulder, leaning forward as though proximity might somehow help them understand how a man entrusted with spiritual authority could also carry the capacity to destroy an entire family. The wooden benches creaked under shifting weight. A few people clutched tissues. Others held notebooks. Some simply clasped their hands in white-knuckled silence. At the front of the room, sunlight spilled through tall windows and cast long, sharp rectangles across the hardwood floors, illuminating dust particles that drifted slowly through the air like suspended moments in time. Prosecutor Elaine Hartfield stood at the table reviewing her opening statement, her posture tense but determined. She had spent months preparing for this trial. She had examined every detail, every scrap of evidence, every forensic report, every timeline reconstruction. Her job was not just to prove Donovan's guilt. It was to protect the integrity of a community left shaken by betrayal. She had prosecuted difficult cases before, but never one that felt so personal to so many people. Never one where the divide between appearance and truth had been so violently exposed. Never one that required her to hold back her own outrage each time she looked at the photographs of Thomas's room, Sophia's journal, Brandy's smile, and Robert's files. Then the room shifted. A quiet murmur spread as the bailiff announced the arrival of the defendant. Michael Donovan entered in shackles, escorted by deputies whose expressions remained deliberately neutral. Gone was the robe, the polished shoes, the carefully groomed image of a spiritual authority figure. In its place stood a man whose entire life had fractured into pieces that no mask, no performance, no controlled tone could reassemble. Yet despite the restraints, despite the orange jumpsuit, despite the weight of the evidence that had accumulated like a mountain on his shoulders, Donovan held his head high, his chin lifted, his gaze steady, his demeanor eerily calm. He walked to the defense table as though entering a church service, as though the courtroom itself was just another congregation he had to convince. The jurors watched him with a mixture of shock and revulsion. Some had grown up hearing him speak. Others had attended events where he once prayed over families and offered blessings with a gentle hand. Now, they watched him sit silently and fold his hands, the chains clinking faintly as he settled into his chair. Judge Meredith Lawson, known for her sharp intellect and unwavering impartiality, entered next. She surveyed the room with a deep, steady breath, fully aware of the emotional weight this trial carried. In a calm, measured voice, she laid out the ground rules, reminding everyone that justice required clarity, patience, and restraint. But even she couldn't ignore the gravity of the moment. A case like this didn't simply pass through the system. It left imprints. It reshaped lives. When the opening statements began, the courtroom stilled until even the smallest soundpaper sliding, breath shifting, fabric rustling echoed with amplified tension. Prosecutor Hartfield rose first. She approached the jury with a slow, deliberate pace, taking a moment to look into the eyes of each juror before she spoke. Her voice carried a quiet force, not loud, not theatrical, but anchored in truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "you are here today to consider the actions of a man who stood before this community as a symbol of morality, compassion, and guidance. A man entrusted with the spiritual well-being of the families who sat in these pews. A man who, behind that trusted facade, made choices so calculated and so cruel that they shattered not only the lives of the Isaac family, but the very foundation of trust within this community." The room hung on every word. Hartfield continued, walking them through the evidence with steady precision. How Donovan had stolen church funds, how Robert uncovered the truth, how that truth threatened Donovan's entire hidden life, and how the murders were not a moment of impulsive rage, but the result of meticulous planning. She described the financial trail, the surveillance footage, the discarded evidence in the ravine, the fingerprint on the broken lock, the fibers, the digital searches, the pattern of lies, the hidden apartment. She spoke of the Isaac family not as case numbers, but as people living, breathing, loving individuals whose futures had been violently erased. When she played the recording of Robert's voicemail, his calm, earnest voice explaining he needed to discuss discrepancies with Donovan, the courtroom fell into a sorrowful silence. It was the voice of a man who trusted the wrong person. A man who had no idea he was stepping into the crosshairs of someone capable of killing to protect a secret. Hartfield ended her opening with a line that cut through the courtroom like a blade. "The evidence will show that Michael Donovan murdered a family of 4, not out of passion, not out of fear, but out of greed, entitlement, and the belief that he, cloaked in the authority of the church, would never be questioned." When she sat down, half the observers released breaths they had been unconsciously holding. Then it was the defense's turn, led by attorney Raymond Keene, a seasoned litigator known for his ability to exploit doubt like a surgeon slicing through tissue. Keene approached the jury with a calm, soothing tone, He didn't deny Donovan's closeness to the Isaac family. He didn't deny the financial discrepancies. Instead, he argued that grief could make people irrational, that coincidences happen, that evidence could be misinterpreted, that investigators, desperate to solve a high-profile tragedy, had zeroed in on Donovan too quickly. He painted a picture of an innocent man caught in a narrative he didn't create, a man who had dedicated decades to his community, now being scapegoated because the truth was too painful for people to face. He ended with the classic defense hook. There is more than one way to interpret these events, but the jurors could feel the difference. Hartfield had presented clarity. King had offered fog. The prosecution's case unfolded over the following days with unrelenting detail. Forensic experts walked the jury through the fingerprint analysis, the chemical breakdown of fibers, the matching DNA profiles, the timeline of the break-in, and the impossibility of the evidence belonging to anyone but Donovan. Crime scene analysts described the patterns of movement and how each action reflected purposeful intent. Financial experts revealed the full depth of embezzlement Donovan had tried to hide for years, money funneled through ghost charities, false ledger entries, personal expenses disguised as ministry outreach. But the testimony that broke the courtroom came from those who had known the Isaacs personally. Brandy's colleague sobbed as she described waiting for her that morning, unaware that her friend had already been killed. Sophia's journalism teacher spoke with tears rolling down her cheeks about a girl with limitless potential. Thomas's baseball coach described the boy's energy on the field, how he always ran with his glove in the air, as if celebrating life itself. The jurors didn't simply hear the evidence. They felt the losses, the human cost, the emotional crater left behind. And through all of it, Donovan remained eerily calm. He barely shifted, barely blinked. He listened to every testimony with a blankness that unsettled observers, as though he were watching events unfold unrelated to himself. That cold stillness, so familiar now, so mechanical, became its own form of confession. Then came the climax of the trial, the decision of whether Donovan would testify. Against the advice of his legal team, Donovan insisted on taking the stand. His motivation wasn't to clear his name. Detective Ellison sensed it immediately. It was something deeper, stranger, and far more unnerving. It was control. He wanted to regain the narrative. He wanted to speak directly to the community he once manipulated so easily. He wanted to perform. When he took the stand, the courtroom tightened like a drum. His voice was steady. His tone was soft. His sentences were carefully constructed, as though delivering a carefully rehearsed sermon rather than a testimony in a quadruple murder trial. He denied everything, deflecting with practiced emotionality. He spoke about betrayal, about being misunderstood, about feeling persecuted. He tried to play the victim, tried to cast doubt on the investigators, tried to reframe the evidence as coincidence or fabrication. But the mask wasn't convincing anymore, not to the jurors, not to the prosecution, not to the community, and certainly not to Judge Lawson, who watched him with a sharp, unreadable gaze. The pivotal moment came during cross-examination. Prosecutor Hartfield approached slowly, holding a printed transcript of Donovan's recovered internet searches. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't grandstand. She simply read aloud each phrase, one by one, letting the courtroom absorb the chilling implications. Silent ways to subdue a victim. How to bypass door censors. Financial fraud prison sentence. How long does skin DNA last? Where to hit to cause instant unconsciousness. Donovan's face froze. Hartfield stepped closer. These are your searches, Father Donovan. Every single one recovered from your device. Would you like to explain to the jury why a priest, someone dedicated to protecting life, would need this information? Silence. Throat tightening. Jaw locking. Eyes flickering with panic for the first time. Hartfield pressed again. Explain it. He didn't, because he couldn't. That silence, after hours of denial, spoke louder than any confession. By the time closing arguments arrived, the weight of the evidence was crushing. Hartfield's final words echoed through the courtroom. Do not let the color blind you. Do not let the calmness fool you. Do not let the performance manipulate you. Follow the evidence. Follow the truth. And give the Isaac family the justice that was stolen from their future. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. Not long, not rushed. Just enough time to weigh every detail with the gravity it deserved. When they returned, the room went breathlessly quiet. The foreperson stood, voice trembling as they read the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder of Robert Isaac, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder of Brandy Isaac, guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder of Thomas Isaac, guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder of Sophia Isaac, guilty. Not a single face in the room remained unmoved. Some cried. Some exhaled shakily. Some sat in stunned silence, processing the enormity of what had just occurred. But the only expression that remained unchanged was Donovan's judge. Lawson delivered the sentence weeks later, 175 years without the possibility of parole. A lifetime for each of the lives he destroyed. When he was led away for the final time, the room didn't erupt in applause. It didn't celebrate. Instead, a solemn, heavy silence filled the space, the kind that comes after witnessing something too profound, too tragic, too irrevocable to respond to in any ordinary way. Justice had been served. But healing, that would take far longer. In the months following Michael Donovan's sentencing, Arcadia became a different town, still familiar in its streets, its schools, its skyline brushed by desert sunsets, but altered in the quiet spaces where memory and healing intertwined. The community did not move on. It moved with the weight of what had happened, each person carrying their own version of grief, confusion, or anger. The Isaac family's home, once bright with laughter and weekend chaos and the easy movement of a family who loved deeply, now stood quietly, its windows reflecting only stillness. Grass grew unevenly along the edges of the yard. The mailbox remained empty. No bicycles leaned against the porch railing. No backpacks lay near the door. Neighbors walking their dogs would slow their pace slightly as they passed, not out of fear anymore, but out of reverence, as if disturbing the air around the house would dishonor the memory of the people who once lived inside. Arcadia had lost the illusion that safety was guaranteed. It had lost the idea that evil always announces itself with dark clothing and a scowl. Instead, the community learned that darkness can sit 3 pews away, offering blessings with a steady hand and a gentle tone. What haunted people was not just the brutality of the murders, but the betrayal, the realization that the man who had worn the cloth of trust had used that position to carry out something unthinkably monstrous. Parents who once encouraged their children to confide in authority figures now hesitated. Parishioners who had once found peace in the gentle hum of Sunday services now entered churches with caution in their eyes. The shock had faded, but the scar remained, the kind that doesn't ache constantly, but twinges when memories surface, sharp and sudden. Yet grief was not the only force shaping Arcadia's future. In its wake came determination, unity, and a fierce resolve to honor the Isaacs in ways that transcended tragedy. Within weeks of Donovan's sentencing, a group of teachers, neighbors, and community members formed the Isaac Legacy Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting students in the district, promoting transparency in local institutions, and providing scholarships in the names of Sophia and Thomas. People donated generously, some out of sorrow, others out of gratitude, all out of a shared belief that the Isaacs deserved to be remembered not as victims, but as lives of meaning and promise. Sophia's scholarship became one of the most sought-after awards in the school district. Each year, students gathered in the auditorium as the lights dimmed and a photograph of her smiling, bright-eyed, holding a microphone during a school broadcast appeared on the screen. Her old teacher, Mrs. Navarro, would step onto the stage with a steady voice that wavered only when she spoke about Sophia's dream of becoming a journalist. The scholarship went to students who showed curiosity, compassion, and courage, qualities Sophia embodied. Over time, dozens of young journalists, writers, and storytellers carried pieces of her legacy with them into college halls and newsrooms around the country. Thomas's baseball league retired his jersey number. His coach, a man with an easy laugh and a quiet tenderness, organized an annual community game in his honor. Kids who had never met Thomas wore wristbands printed with his initials, their cleats kicking up dust as they ran the same bases he once sprinted across with uncontainable excitement. Families lined the bleachers, cheering loudly not just for the sport, but for the spirit of a boy whose joy had once been big enough to fill an entire field. Brandy's colleagues created a reading nook in the elementary school library, complete with soft lighting, beanbags, and shelves stocked with her favorite books. A plaque above her read, "In loving memory of a teacher who believed every child had a story worth hearing." Students curled up with picture books and chapter novels, unaware of the person who inspired the space, yet touched by her influence all the same. And for Robert, the district implemented new financial transparency policies, regular audits, external oversight, and whistleblower protections. His meticulous work, once seen as routine, became recognized as courageous. He hadn't been searching for wrongdoing. He had been trying to protect an institution he believed in. The reforms that followed ensured that no one in power would ever again hold unquestioned authority over church or school finances. Robert's legacy became one of integrity, subtle, steady, and vital. While the community rebuilt piece by piece, Donovan's trial and conviction became a national case study lectured in criminal justice programs, dissected by forensic analysts, featured in investigative documentaries. Experts highlighted not just the brutality of the crime, but the psychology of the killer, a man who hid his manipulative, narcissistic nature behind the facade of holiness. His ability to compartmentalize, to preach virtue while committing evil, became a chilling reminder of how masks can be constructed so skillfully that even seasoned observers miss the cracks. Detective Mara Ellison, who had once stood in the Isaac hallway and felt the weight of silence pressing against her lungs, found herself invited to speak at conferences about the case. She approached those invitations with humility, never glamorizing the details, never forgetting the faces behind the evidence bags. She spoke about vigilance, about the importance of intuition, about the quiet alarms that sometimes ring inside investigators long before evidence catches up. But she always ended by returning to the core truth. 4 people lost their lives not because evil is clever, but because it is often disguised as something familiar. Privately, the Isaac case stayed with her. She occasionally drove past the house, not frequently, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of respect. She would park down the street, sit in her car for a few minutes, and think about the moments, decisions, and conversations that had led her team to justice. She thought about the night she first opened Robert's financial documents and felt the rush of clarity. She thought about standing in the courtroom as the verdict was read. She thought about the foundation, the scholarships, the games, the reading nook. And she knew, each time, that justice had been served, but healing was its own journey, one that stretched beyond any sentence or verdict. Arcadia gradually rediscovered its rhythm. Summers came with barbecues and pool parties. Autumn brought school fairs and football games. Winter evenings glowed with twinkling lights. The shadows of the past hadn't vanished, but the light grew stronger than the darkness. Children rode bicycles again. Neighbors talked openly. Churches introduced new leaders grounded in transparency and oversight. Trust, though scarred, began to regrow. Every year, on the anniversary of the Isaac family's deaths, candles appeared outside their former home. Some were placed by people who knew them well, others by those who had never met them but felt connected through the shared grief of the tragedy. Letters were left by students whose scholarships bore Sophia's name. Baseballs were left by children who played in Thomas's honor. Flowers were placed by coworkers who missed Brandy's laugh, and by volunteers who admired Robert's diligence. Each candle, each flower, each note spoke not of death, but of remembrance, resilience, and love. And though Donovan spent the rest of his life behind bars, his name stripped of titles, his influence dissolved, his presence became nothing more than a cautionary tale about unchecked power and moral rot hidden beneath divine robes. When students studied the case, they discussed not just the brutality, but the importance of truth, accountability, and the courage of those who expose hidden violence. What lingered most in Arcadia was not the horror, but the legacy of a family who lived fully, loved deeply, and inspired change far beyond their years. Their story continued to ripple outward, shaping policies, inspiring compassion, and reminding people that justice is not only a punishment, it is a promise to the future. In the quiet of the desert evenings, when the sky turned a soft, dusky rose and the cicadas hummed in the distance, Arcadia felt a sense of peace it had not known in a long time. A hard-earned peace, a fragile peace, but peace nonetheless. The kind that comes after truth is unearthed, after justice is served, after a community chooses not to be defined by tragedy, but by the strength that grows in its wake. The Isaacs were gone, but they were not lost. Their laughter lived in baseball fields. Their dreams lived in scholarships. Their kindness lived in classrooms. Their integrity lived in reforms. Their memory lived in every act of courage inspired by their story. And in this way, quietly, powerfully, and forever, they became more than the victims of a monstrous act. They became the reason a town learned to rebuild itself from the inside out. In the end, their legacy was not written by the man who took their lives, but by the people who refused to let their light fade.